Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us today for Giovanni's webinar on how goal ambiguity affects our decision making. I speak to you from my home in Wiradjuri country and want to acknowledge the very first systems thinkers of this land, maybe the world even, who've shared their knowledge freely in the past, and I hope we can do that generosity justice now and into the future. And just before we begin, I'd like to quickly mention as the host, the Oceania chapter of the System Dynamics Society. We run these webinars regularly, and the chapter connects or seeks to connect systems thinkers and system dynamicists, practitioners, researchers, and enthusiasts across Australia, New Zealand, and the wider region as well. And our focus really is on collaboration, learning, and creating community. So I'm going to put the website into the chat as well for any connections or if you want to sign up for other webinars. And now I'm delighted to introduce Giovanni Cunico, who is a PhD candidate still. I think you've submitted, so yeah, still counts, from the University of New South Wales in Australia. And Giovanni's research explores decision-making in complex strategic settings and contexts, drawing on his background in political science and system dynamics. He holds a European Master in System Dynamics and has held research fellowships at the UCL, like University College London, where he contributed to a retrofit policy for UK government, and at the University of Bologna on an EU-funded project evaluating European regional policy. And Gio's work, and we're going to get a glimpse of it today, really focuses on system dynamics and participatory approaches to policy making, and with a particular interest in sustainability transitions and how we can better analyze and design policies in complex social systems. So over to you, Giovanni. Tell us all about ambiguity and decision making.
Thanks, Mia. Let me share my screen as we're all used to. Sure.
Oh, and just for everyone, we'll have a session runs about 40 to 45 minutes, and there'll be questions at the end possible, but you can plug them into the chat as well. Thank you.
Oops, sorry. And I think since we are not so many people, feel free to interrupt me if there are some questions or something is unclear, so make it more easygoing. So yeah, thanks, Mia, for introducing me. Very nice overview of my career. And yeah, the topic of today is my research on ambiguous goal and their effect on decision making. That was the focus of my PhD here at UNSW. And before we jump into the topic, I wanted to give you a brief background about myself, and I think Miriam mentioned most of it. So background in political science, where I got my bachelor degree, and then I got trained actually with Miriam in the Erasmus Master's Systemics program, and now I'm completing hopefully my PhD Management and Governance at UNSW. What I'm very passionate about is how complex systems behave over time, in particular how they adapt or change, or actually how they don't change, and how decision-making actually unfolds and occurs in these systems, and how we can support policy development in these systems. And as Mira mentioned, I've been working on policy design for household retrofitting in UK, and also European Union regional policy, and why it was underperforming. And now during my PhD, I've been more focused on sustainability transitions. So I've been working on the optimal policy mix between adaptation and mitigation, on how we can move beyond GDP, and also how we use information in sustainability decision-making, which is actually the topic of today's webinar. So this is the structure of my speech today. So I will just spend actually quite a lot of time in illustrating the problem, because I wanted to reconstruct the journey I went through, and then the hypothesis I developed. Then I will present the research design I used. So I used some experiments to test my hypothesis, and I will show the experimental task I developed, and then the results, which I think could be interesting for you, and some theoretical and also practical reflection that we can take away from this session. So starting with the problem, I started my PhD with this mindset. So I had the expectation actually that is also shared by many people, that if we provide additional relevant information to decision makers, this information is actually used to improve decisions. And this idea actually challenges the approach of decision making that is based on opinion, intuition, personal experiences. And the idea of providing information to policymakers actually is super old, very, very old, and can be dated back at least the ancient Greeks. And this principle is foundational to many applied sciences, which includes information systems, research utilization, implementation science, operational research, evidence-based decision-making, and also including system analysis, because if we think carefully, most of our work is based on the assumption that we will provide insights to policymakers, and they hopefully will use it to improve the decisions. And there is also actually a lot of experimental evidence that shows how decisions are strongly affected by the information they are received, right? And we know that variations in type, quantity, quality, they all significantly affect decision outcomes. And actually, also we know that people actually are very susceptible even to the way the information is presented. So while reading literature, I learned that different graphical formats, like if we provide a table or a graph over time with the same information, will lead to different decisions. Or even the way we organize this information, what comes first and second, will have a significant impact on individual and also organizational decisions, and also how we frame this information is very important. And interesting enough, I also discovered that also the color used that we use in our figures and information can affect decisions. And also if we put plus and minuses, some performance markers in tables will affect decisions. So the main message is also experimental evidence shows us that as humans, we are very sensitive to the information we receive. But when we look outside in the world around us, we see limited influence of information on policy outcomes, right? And actually, this is where I started my journey. I was initially very interested in the beyond GDP transition, which basically suggests that GDP, gross domestic product, is the main measurement of progress nowadays in our societies. And it has a lot of limitations. And there are a lot of call for actions to move beyond to implement different indicators. And although most of these proposed indicators are often not used, the few that reach actually the policy rooms, they do not show any impact on the policy outcomes. And I found it, when I was reading about this, I found it very surprising. And then I decided to scale it up. I started to look, on how sustainability information at large is used. And also there is a gap between the policies that are implemented and the actions we recommend with our information that we provide as scholars to policymakers. And I was very fascinated because now some scholars in sustainability field are even questioning if the principles or evidence-based decision-makings apply to their field. And often it is flagged that sustainability information appear to be driven more by the worldviews of decision makers in terms of their beliefs or values than by information itself. And then I said, okay, let's take a broader look. And this limited influence on information is actually a very common use that is diffused in many, many domains. And so it has been often found that the fact that decision makers acquire and have information available does not guarantee that they will use it accordingly. And here I just wanted to report some examples from Australia. So YouGov made a survey in 2022, and although 93% of Australian business leaders value evidence for their organizational success, they still recognize that 41% of their decisions is still based on intuition. And then there was another survey from BARC in 2016, where 58% of respondents believe that at least half of their decision was still based on gut feelings and personal experiences. So you see how still important decisions are not based on evidence, but on other drivers. And also for us in the systemics literature, we have actually plenty of examples of very well-crafted SD models that are delivered to policymakers. The simulations are delivered, but they don't have any impact on the policy outcomes. And here I also reported a partial quote from Sterman that I found very interesting and fun, where he said that research shows that showing research does not influence decisions, which I think summarizes all these questions. However, the literature actually already provides us with some insights on why this is happening. And we have two sets of barriers. The first set of barriers is at the social level. So there is the culture, the leadership style, the organizational dynamics, the power play in the organization, and all these interferences at the social level that can impede the instrumental use of information. Also, we have individual cognitive barriers to the information use. So, people are boundedly rational, and so they may not be motivated, they may not perceive the usefulness of the information. Of course, they have personal agendas, which may affect how they prioritize information and what they use, or probably they purposefully do not use some information. They may be lacking critical thinking skills to recognize the importance of information. Maybe they don't trust the source of information, or they may have other biases that impede or interfere with the use of information provided to them. And these two micro and macro barriers actually have also been flagged within the sustainability information research domain. However, there are still some unexplained differences. And what I found very interesting is that there are some decisions that seem to be consistently influenced less by the information provided. And these decisions, unfortunately, are the key or most important ones. So here I just reported some quotes from the literature. And the first one is from Weiss in 1979, where she recognized that information has not much impact in policy decisions, but if it has it, it's usually on relatively low-level, narrow-gauge decisions. And it has also been found that policymakers, when they have to take more political decisions, try to rely more and more exclusively on internally produced information. So information that is produced within their same organization. But when they're handling more technical decisions with narrow scopes, they also try and tend to engage more with external sources. And recently, Carney and Oliver, 2017, they flagged that actually evidence-based policymaking is not like evidence-based medicine. And when I read it, it was making a lot of sense because they are literally two different processes. And they also flagged again that worldviews seems to be more important in policymaking than in medicine. So this difference, this consistently non-use of information in more important decisions is not actually fully explained by the two set of barriers I mentioned to you, because at the individual level, we could assume that these barriers are normally distributed across population. So we shouldn't see this consistent non-use of information within the same tasks. And also the social institutional barriers should have the same effect within the same organization. So within the same organization, we should see the use or non-use of information independently of the type of decisions. So I was left with these questions that were, why does information often appear to have limited influence on important strategic decisions? And why do worldviews seem to drive these decisions? And of course, I made some hypotheses that were based on this idea that the variations in the impact of information, they depend on the nature of the task. And the main problem is that policymaking problems are structured, messier, complex, and weak. And getting back to the comparison between policy issues and medicine issues, when I was thinking about it, was very clear. In medicine, we want to collect as much information as possible to improve our diagnosis, to make them better, right? But in policymaking, this is not so clear-cut. And there are many differences between these type of decisions. And the one that I thought was very crucial is the goals. And specifically, policymaking problems, they tend to have ambiguous goals. And before I describe in more details what are ambiguous goals, I think it's important to clarify the cognitive function of goals. So first of all, goals are everywhere. They are everywhere in our lives. And every decision is a goal-directed process. All of our behaviors are directed by goals. And sometimes these goals are explicitly set. Some other times they are not. For example, when we dress up in the morning, we have a goal. It's just we are not fully aware of what goals we are pursuing. And goals are very, very important because they provide direction for our actions and motivations. So they define the goal dimension we want to pursue and what is the aspiration level of this in this goal dimension. And goals have hundreds or even more of characteristics. They could be set externally, so like if you are in an organization, we receive a task to pursue, that's a goal, or they can be set internally by ourselves when we set some personal growth goals, right? Or as I mentioned, they could be conscious goals or unconscious goals. And unfortunately, goal ambiguity challenges all these fundamental functions of goals. So goal ambiguity is an idea, is a construct that comes from organizational science and public policy. And it's a situation where decision makers must navigate a situation with multiple interrelated objectives that are ill-defined, vague, or unclear. And a bit more formally, these emerge when the decision landscape is characterized by trade-off between goals. So it's impossible to maximize multiple goals, but if we pursue goal A, we will have a lower performance on goal B, or vice versa. So if we pursue goal B, we'll have a lower performance on goal A. And these emerge when we do not have an overarching goal that provides some prioritization on our actions. So I'll report here some examples to try to make it a bit more tangible what I'm speaking about. So let's consider this case of public library that was reported by Dorner. So let's assume you work in a public library and your manager gives you a task of making the library more user-friendly with a limited budget. And this is an ambiguous goal, ambiguous task, because you could use this budget to buy new books, or you could use this budget to extend the opening hours or buy new sofa. But if you pursue buying new books, you don't have enough funds to pursue extending the opening hours, right? So you see there's a trade-offs and there's not clear prioritization what to do. And when the decision maker is faced with situation, is lacking direction for his action. Another example is the one of the economic minister. So this minister is tasked by the premier to improve the condition for the low and middle income workers. And there it can take different directions, right? It could cut taxes, or it could try to preserve and improve public services. But if it cut taxes, it doesn't have enough resources to improve or preserve public services, and vice versa. If you want to invest more, you will have to increase taxes. Or a very, very common example that often happens in our life is when we are dealing with a problem with multiple conflicting course of actions, and our managers tell us, do your best. And there we are clearly facing a goal ambiguous situation because we don't know which direction to take, so it's up to us. And if you wonder how common is this goal ambiguity, actually, unfortunately, it is very common. So as I said, goal ambiguity characterizes all the important strategic decisions. And this is very, very common in public organizations because they are made of many stakeholders, and all these stakeholders have different objectives, different preferences, and then trying to pull the organization in different directions. So it's a very common situation in this context. And also, actually, the sustainability goal itself, it's very ambiguous because there is not a clear definition of sustainability. There are more than 300 definitions. And so what sustainability means to me probably means something else to you. And what we are pursuing is something different. And a very famous example of goal ambiguity and sustainability are the Sustainable Development Goals, because they have so many sub-goals that some of them are in contrast. For example, in short term, it has been shown that goal 2, promote economic growth, is very likely to be in contrast with goal 13 of climate action in protecting the environment. And also I was having recently a chat with Bill, a notable member from our community, where he was flagging to me that he also experienced when he was consulting for the Canadian government a case of goal ambiguity when he was advising on the community energy planning initiative. So also in our daily consultant life, it's very common to stumble across these goal ambiguity situations. But this is not just common for public organizations, actually. In recent years, it has also become the norm in businesses, where they are, because nowadays, in the past, businesses were just called and demanded to maximize profits, but now we expect them to maximize profits still, but also to fulfill some social responsibilities. And very often in many businesses, these two goals are the trade-off. So if I want to protect the environment or have some social functions, probably I will have to lower my profits and vice versa. So also in businesses, we have these challenges. And here I reported this fun statistic for me. So from Australia, so strategies in businesses are so ambiguous and vague that in a survey, only 29 of employees in Australia were able to identify the organizational strategies when they were shown 5 options, because they all look the same to them. Just to give a bit the sense how ambiguous sometimes these strategies are. So I made the hypothesis that ambiguous goals do not provide adequate guidance, but is a void in which decision direction we need to pursue. But still, we need some directions for action. So my hypothesis was that in ambiguous decision context, decision makers often fill this void with the information at hand and with their own worldviews, which they both become the basis for actions and affect how information is used. And here is just the statistical model I wanted to test. So I assumed there was some main effect from information to decisions and from worldviews to decisions, but that goal ambiguity would moderate these effects. And to try to answer these questions, I decided to use some experiments. So I employed some computer-based dynamic decision-making experiments where I took, probably you all know this model, the word dynamics model made by Forrester in 1971. I rebuilt it and I recalibrated it. And I recalibrated it in a way that I could replicate the sustainability trade-off between economic growth and environment I was mentioning to you. So what I did, I added 2 policies. One is called productivity improvement, and the other one is called pollution reduction. And these 2 policies are in contrast in 6 indicators. So over the 6 indicators that you see here that are pollution, economic capital, material standards of living, quality of life, natural resources, and pollution index, if you pursue one policy, you will minimize the effect of some indicator, maximize on the others, and vice versa. So what does it mean? I also reported here the payoff of these 6 indicators, hopefully to make this situation clearer. So on the x-axis, you have the policy of environmental protection. And on the y-axis, the policy of productivity growth. And here in the graphs, you see the 6 indicators I was mentioning to you, and the red area shows where, based on which policy this indicator is maximized, where the blue area is when it is minimized. So if you see, if we allocate the most of the resources available in this model to productive growth, we maximize 3 indicators: population, economic volume, and the material standard of living. Instead, if we have a balanced approach, we will maximize the quality of life. And finally, if we allocate all of our resources to protect the environment, we will have the best outcomes in natural resources management and the pollution index. So here you see that I try to replicate, to reconstruct this trade-off between economic growth and sustainability protection. So where if you allocate to one policy, you minimize some indicators, maximize some indicators, and instead, in contrast, if you allocate to the other policy, you maximize others. So then I took this model and I made it in a game, actually, which I call Planet X, where people had to decide how to allocate a fixed budget between 2 policies with the support of these 6 indicators. And if we have still time, I think I can stop these slides to show how the model works very briefly. Let me stay here. Here we go, share. Hope you can see that. So I also share the link in the chat if you want to have a look by yourself. So to log in, you have to type 10,000 as your simulator ID. You click enter, you can get in. So here, since it was an experiment, we provided decision makers with a task description. I'm not going to read it to you. Then they could read their goal in more detail. And there was also an explanation of the indicator they could see in their dashboards. But anyway, then when they could start the simulator, they landed here. You see there are the two policies here on the left and the 6 indicators. And for example, if we maximize productivity, then we can see what happened over time. So we can advance quickly just to show you. So you see here we maximize population, economic capital, material standards of living, but instead we have very natural resources, very low natural resources, and very high pollution. And basic quality of life stops at 1. And then they could try another strategy in the experiment. Let's assume they allocated everything to pollution reduction very quickly. You see now, economic capital is very low, population is low, material standards of living didn't increase much, quality of life went to 120, which is a bit better, but still okay. Natural resources is much better, and pollution is very low. So I hope that this, or I can also maybe show you a more balanced strategy actually. So if we allocate 50-50, you will see how we maximize, for example, perceived quality of life. So in this simulation, while all the other indicators are average, perceived quality of life is at the maximum. So this was the experimental task we use. Let me go back to my slide. Sorry for this. There we go. So we took this SD model and we made it into a game, basically, with this layout. And what were the results? So I'm going to just briefly report the results of 2 experiments we conducted. So the design of the first experiment is the following. First, we measure participants' worldview. And then we randomly allocated them to 4 different conditions. So the first condition, in the first condition, we manipulated the goal. Some people received the ambiguous goal. It was lead this fictional planet X to a thriving future, which is, I think you can see how vague it is. While another group got a clear goal. It was maximize the perceived quality of life indicator, which was very specific. And then the other manipulation was the information. Some people only saw 4 indicators in their dashboard. They got population, economic capital, material standards of living, quality of life. So they were mostly focused on growth. And the other group, they saw an extended dashboard. So they saw the 4 indicators plus the 2 environmental ones, natural resources and pollution. So you see how the 2 dashboards look like. So we are missing these 2 indicators in the limited dashboard. And finally, we asked them what they believe was the optimal allocation for the goal for Planet X. And then we measure their goal ambiguity perception at the end. And so we were able to recruit 255 participants online. And we found that the information provided in the worldviews had a direct effect on decisions. They were significant, but also very interesting that actually goal ambiguity moderated these effects. How? Well, here I'm showing the results. So the allocation to the growth policy as a function of the worldviews. So where 1 in the worldviews shows our inclination towards sustainability, and 7 shows a worldview more prone to economic growth. So the people who got the clear goal of maximizing quality of life and only got the limited dashboard with the growth indicators were not affected by the worldviews. So you see this flat line, and they had a balanced strategy. They always allocated 50%, more or less 55% of their resources to economic growth. People who got the clear goal, but also the 6 indicators, so the 2 additional environmental indicators, allocated slightly more to the growth policy, but still were not affected by the worldviews. Very interesting, the people who got the ambiguous goals and the limited dashboard were very severely affected by the worldviews. So you see how the slope of the line is crossing the others. So the more we were participants were pro-growth, the more they allocated to the growth strategy. And the people who got the ambiguous goal, but also the two additional stability indicators, were still very affected by the worldviews, but the decisions were anchored at a lower level. So providing additional information was having an effect on them. So I tried to summarize these insights in a simple way. So the effect of this additional, no relevant information for the clear goal was null. Like getting these two additional indicators, which were not important for understanding how to maximize quality of life, had no impact on the decision in the clear goal condition. But in the unclear goal, ambiguous goal had a very strong effect. So people who receive additional indicators of stability in ambiguous goals were affected by that. Similarly, in the clear goal, people were not affected by the worldviews. Zero, not at all. But they were very strongly affected by the worldviews in an ambiguous situation. So, and this effect was even stronger than the effect of information, which we found very interesting. And the other interesting thing was the results of the question on the goal ambiguity perception. So we asked a yes/no question to the participants at the end. It was the goal for Planet X provided to you set forward? And 50% of people in the experiment had a clear goal, and the 48% of the people in the experiment got the ambiguous and clear goal. And you see here in the graph that the percentage of people who said no to this question, so that they perceive the goal as ambiguous, is very similar for the group of people with a clear goal and the ambiguous goal, which we found very interesting. So we led to the other idea that actually decision makers may also be not aware of goal ambiguity and the impact of their worldviews on their decisions. And actually this would be coherent with the literature because, as I was mentioning to you, the goal setting and interpretation can also be a subconscious process. Often we interpret goals and we set goals automatically without fully rationalizing them. And then we run another experiment in which we use the same design as the experiment one, but we change the goal manipulation. So in the literature, there is no clear definition of how ambiguous goals are operationalized. So we decided to explore a different way of operationalizing them. So if in the first experiment, we provided a very overarching and clear goal, here we task participants to enhance the economic and environmental states to maximize them. So we gave them two contrasting goals that was not possible. And in the clear goal, in this case, we told them to maximize, to improve as much as possible Planet X environment. Changing this goal manipulation so affected the way ambiguous goals are operationalized and also made the additional two indicators that we were changing in the dashboards more relevant for the decisions in the clear goal. And the results were very interesting because in the clear situation, having these two indicators proved to be very important. So people who have or didn't have were severely affected by this in their decisions, much more than in the ambiguous condition. So having relevant information in the clear goal is very important, even more impactful than having additional information in the ambiguous situation. However, what was very surprising for us was the effect of worldviews. So in these ambiguous conflicting situations, the people who got the limited dashboard, so only 4 indicators, were again very strongly affected by their worldviews, as you see here in the full line with a strong slope. But the people who got the same goal, but the 6 indicators, so the full set of information, they were not affected by the worldviews. As you see here by the flat line. So again, using our scale metaphor, in the ambiguous conflicting goal situation, having limited information triggers the effect of our worldviews. While if we have all the information we need, we didn't see the effect of worldviews, which was very interesting. So it seems very clear that the way goal ambiguity is operationalized is very important. So which in practice means that if we task someone with an ambiguous goal, it depends how we frame it. If we frame it as an unclear overarching goal, as in the first experiment, we can expect some behaviors. But if we frame it as a conflicting goal, we'll have a different behavior, or at least a different impact of the worldviews. And this impact seems to be moderated by this effect, by the information. And a possible tentative explanation is that under these conflicting goals, decision makers naturally seek balance between the two goals. And so when the information is limited, this gap is filled with their worldviews. But this is a very initial hypothesis for the effect. And finally, again, we found that people struggle to recognize goal ambiguity. So we asked the same questions, and there was the amount of people who said no, that the goal was not clear between the clear group and the ambiguous group was the same number. There was no difference. So again, they struggled to recognize it. And so I wanted to conclude with some theoretical, but also out of practical reflection that could be helpful for us. So I think the main takeaways of this research journey are that clear versus ambiguous goals stimulate two different cognitive processes in the decision-making process. So goal ambiguity moderates the impact of information and worldviews on decisions. And that was strong in both experiments. And in general, it seems that the impact of additional information and worldviews is amplified in ambiguous goal situations, which, and in this contrast with the clear goals, where the explicit objectives limit the influence of additional information and worldviews. So in my mind, I think like an open door. The more goals are ambiguous, the more we open the door for the influence of external objects like information and worldviews. And actually, this provides an explanation for my initial problem, that was why information is not impactful in strategic decisions. Well, we probably don't see this effect because worldviews start to play a stronger role in ambiguous situations, and this stronger role can overshadow the influence of information. So that's why we may see that worldviews drive decisions in these situations. And this also can provide an explanation why in experiments usually we see people to be very sensitive to the information. And the reason is that in the largest majority of experimental research on decisions, researchers use clear goals. And so they basically, by doing that, they eliminate the effects of worldviews and they just capture the effect of information. So that could explain this discrepancy. And another important thing I think you may want to bring home is that the way we operationalize these goals is very important, makes a strong difference. And that it seems that we, as human beings, may struggle to recognize these ambiguous goals. So some practical reflections. So all this research translates that we need to be aware that goal ambiguity poses a challenge for us as scholars, as practitioners, as system analysts. And this is something you need to take into account when we want to provide some decision support and knowledge to policymakers. So probably the most important thing is that we need to recognize when we're dealing with ambiguous goals, and we need to support decision makers accordingly. So this is a very rough distinction, but when the tasks we are helping policymakers with are clear, I think our jobs focuses more on maximization optimizations. But when these tasks are a bit ambiguous, I think we should start with problem structuring approaches because they become much more important. And also we should consider whether we should train policymakers in recognizing and in dealing with goal ambiguity. Because this stronger effect of worldviews is something that can create very strong biases in decisions. And also, something I was discussing, I think at the symposium in Melbourne, that there could also be some ethical considerations. When we support policymakers, decision makers in their ambiguous goal task, we are inherently intervening in the problem definition. And I can come up with many examples in which, in these situations, actually policymakers were looking at tasks as researchers for clarifying their goals. They want to get clarity on that. And when we do that, we are extremely strongly affecting their decision ultimately. So we should also reflect on what are the limits of these interventions. And I wanted to conclude with a warning, because sometimes when I present this work, people go away with the wrong message, that goal ambiguity is bad. No, it is not. It's not necessarily bad, because it has also some positive things. So it has been shown that goal ambiguous situation and strategies can help to bring together diverse stakeholders who have different perspective and priorities, and if they face a very narrow task objective, may not want to collaborate. So if we present a very vague, ambiguous strategy, it's more likely we can get all the stakeholders together to interact. And also, goal ambiguity has been shown multiple times that it can stimulate discussion and exploration of the system and learning about the system. So it can also be a growth opportunity. And unfortunately, goal ambiguity is part of our work, is part of complex system and strategies, so it's often unavoidable. And we should treat these situations as opportunities. Because when we face ambiguous goals, as I told you, we will use our worldviews to make decisions. So it's a moment in which we can express our values and priorities. And also, we should never forget that there are some strategies that can help us to cope with goal ambiguity. And in this situation, I think the main principle is to try to deconstruct the problem in smaller pieces. And we have also established techniques that can help us, like, as I was mentioning, problem structuring methods like group model building, SODA, or there are many more, or also multi-criteria decision making, where we force policymakers to give way, to prioritize between different goals. And also, a fun trick that I found very useful in my career is that when we are facing trade-offs between goals, we can try to extend time horizons. So, for example, in the sustainability context, economic growth and environmental protection are trade-offs in the short term. But if you extend the time horizon to a couple of centuries, probably we will see that the environmental protection is a prerequisite for economic growth. So changing the time boundaries, time horizons, we also can get rid of some of the trade-offs. And I wanted to flag some limitations of my research. So actually there are many limitations. Here are just the three most important ones. I've been only using the span text task for my experiments. So this is a clear limit to the generalizability of my findings. And also the measurement of goal ambiguity perception is very rudimentary. I was just asking a yes/no question. So in the future, I'm planning to use a much more robust, refined question. And note, I've only been using variance experiments. So I've not been looking very closely on how decision makers take decisions. So the next steps of my research try to overcome these limitations. And I'm trying to develop some training for policymakers on how they could recognize and effectively approach goal ambiguity. And so if anybody's interested in that, please reach out. This is my email. Feel free to send me an email whenever you feel like. And that was it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Giovanni. Yeah, I've been hearing about this work ongoingly. I've got so many little questions and ideas and things. But are there any questions in the room?
I'll have a go. Well done, Giovanni. That's great work. I wonder if you could just reflect a bit on the Matlin paper, which we've both been using, which talks about the confluence between ambiguity and conflict, which goes to your points about structured goal structuring and implementation. So perhaps you could just speak to that.
So yeah, great question. And I think I've been reflecting on this a lot since you shared the paper with me a few months ago. And the way I see that is that my work and Matlan work, which is a massive and great piece of work, is that we are focusing on different level of analysis and different times of the policy process. So Matlan is specifically focused on implementation. So the process after we set the policy, while I'm focused on the process prior the decision on which direction we decide. So the way I see that is that my work is just complementing his work in showing that it's not just a problem of implementation after, but also on how we get to that decision before.
Yeah, but that's very true. But he's reflecting particularly on public policy. So there was a process leading up to the goals that he investigated. So for people listening, Matlin investigated how the confluence between ambiguity in a goal and conflict plays out as those public policies are implemented. But what I was really after your thoughts about was how everything that you've done influences the development of those goals in the first place. So what I found interesting was the potential, as you noted, that at early stages of policy change, that ambiguity could actually be helpful because it reduces the cognitive dissonance potentially between people's worldview and the outcomes. But I think your perspective on the time horizon is particularly important for system dynamics people.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on this. I 100% agree. As I wanted to try to do it in the end is I want to give the message that goal ambiguity can be helpful sometimes. As we were discussing via email, like it helps to put people together with different ideas and perspectives. If we have a very narrow goal, probably sometimes stakeholders don't want to get engaged in that project. If we are a bit more ambiguous with that, it can help us to put them together. So yeah, I agree 200%. Thank you very much.
Stephen, take the floor.
Be careful what you wish for. Giovanni, that is great. Lots of stimulation there. I had an observation and then a question. Keep the observation short. I was just wondering if at any stage you'd canvassed the level of involvement with the worldviews, because just having come from a social science background, I know that that is an important construct, and it's a very rich field to be explored, because that is shown to affect the level of information processing that happens, as well as there are some direct links to behaviors. And then my second question was, or the question was very brief. Just, are you able to give us some idea of what the sample makeup was? So were they students, or were they the 250 odd, or were they, a broader cross-section?
So concerning the sample, they were mostly managers and decision makers in the organizations. So we tried to recruit a sample that was closer to our population of interest. It was very expensive, but I think we managed that. And concerning the motivation, I think you are touching a very sensitive nerve. So we ran this experiment online. And when you put people online, you cannot control in detail what they do, check their motivation, because they do it for money usually. So that's a limitation. And we are being assuming a normal distribution of motivation between worldviews, which is, as you just said, a strong assumption. And what I'm planning to do in the future is to take a different approach. Instead of collecting and engaging with large samples and check the variance between different groups, is to have a small sample and monitor the decision process step by step with verbal protocols. So basically, I will sit down with the decision maker in the room, and I will ask them to play the game and to say out loud what they're thinking, what they're doing, and why. In this case, I can get an insight on the motivation, what they're thinking. So in this way, I can get more insights on these cognitive/social elements that you were flagging. Because at the moment, to be fair, we are assuming a normal distribution.
And it's one of the challenges when you get into cognition is we tend to use multivariate statistics, whereas many social scientists also use non-parametric statistics, because the assumptions around normal distributions can be a little bit problematic. But it's great. I love the experimental approach. Well done.
Thank you very much.
I just had a little question. So just on when you asked them, did you feel like your goal was ambiguous? Was there any definition that you provided of what ambiguity meant in that context, or was that sort of just left up to them to decide, what they felt about that?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ethan. So I asked them, was the goal ambiguous, yes or no? And then so behind that, I specified. When I say ambiguous, I mean straightforward what you were supposed to achieve with the goal we gave you, which, in my opinion, I felt was clear enough at the moment. But when I was reflecting months after the experiment, when I was writing my dissertation, I felt like, as you just flagged, maybe it was not so clear. So that's why I felt it was a limitation of the research. So because maybe I was picking up not goal ambiguity, but goal understanding, which is a slightly different construct. So maybe they interpret the question like, did you understand the goal? Which was not what I was after. So in the future, I'm planning to, first, I need to develop a scale that measures goal ambiguity because it does not exist at the moment, test it, and then use it to avoid just the issue you flagged.
Thank you.
Thank you to you, actually. Great question.
Can I build on that just quickly? Because one question, and I know Tom and you with more questions later, but one question I had was whether, so are the benefits that we associate with goal ambiguity lost if people don't realize that the goal is ambiguous? Like, so if you link that to, so yes, if it's ambiguous, we'll go, oh, we don't know, we'll ask some people. But if I think I know, I'm not going to ask anyone. And is there a dissonance that might counter the benefit?
So I think there are some implicit and explicit benefits in goal ambiguity. And one implicit one is that when goals are ambiguous, we tend to explore the system more. This is just and this is something that is explicit, implicit, and I think that actually has been happening even when people were not recognizing the goal when it was ambiguous. So I think that's always there. But if you give some training and you can recognize when goals are ambiguous, you will be more likely to spot that you wouldn't be more likely to be influenced by the worldviews and be biased. And so try to put a break to that, or at least be aware that this is not so obvious. So I think there's some clear benefits and some that are more hidden in that. Yeah.
Cool, thanks. Anybody else?
That's it.
Maybe. Yeah. Is your game experiment available on IC Interchange?
Yes, it is. I think I shared the link in the chat.
Let me just check that.
Let me share it again just to be sure everybody can see that. So this is the link if anybody wants to play with it. And if you want to access, you need to use this number.
Awesome
Put
stuff.
10,000, press enter, you can use it.
So much for growth.
Yeah, that link works. So yeah.
Great, thanks, Stephen.
Well, thank you, Jude. And maybe we wrap up here. A round of applause to you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for sharing. And I'm just, thanks all for coming. This video will be available online in a few days, thanks to Hossein's magic. And we'll share that on LinkedIn. And also making a plug for our next webinar, which will be with Adam Hume, who will share his new software approach to make CLDs more analytically accessible, I guess. That'll be really interesting. You'll see him all over the place. The Dynamic Society is like harvesting him like crazy, but we get him first. And he's one of ours. So that's good. Is there anything else we can play? Oh, and we're looking for abstracts for our symposium, which is in February. I think it's the 5th and the 6th. So session on the 6th, but on the 5th we'll get some training thanks to Andrew doing a roundtable on group model building. So if you know anyone, look that up on our website. I had a link somewhere. Give me this. So if you're not already familiar with this, jump online, have a look, share it around. I think that's it. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
You have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, Joe.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.